Hey everyone, so I'm going to kind of tell you how the information processing system works. So in 1968, Atkinson and Scherfen are credited with the term store model. Also, you might be familiar with the analogy that our brain is kind of a computer, kind of how it works. So they theorize that when we store info, we store it into three different parts: the sensory register, the short-term memory store, you're a little familiar with that, and the long-term memory store. Not that new, but we'll dive a little deeper into it. So sensory register are your sights and sounds, but only for a moment's glimpse. If you don't preserve it with some kind of mental strategy, like studying, if you just kind of sit into a lecture but don't really study the material, you're not really going to remember it. So that's what sensory register is. They're just kind of your sights and sounds, but only for a moment's glimpse. Then we move into short term, which is how many pieces of info that can be held at once. Recently I did a class exercise, and our professor for this class had a list of names, different, objects, nouns, whatever, listed on board, and she'd let us see it for 10-20 seconds, and then she'd turn it off. And so we just kind of had to write on paper how many that we remembered. And, that's your short-term memory. Anyways, your long-term memory is your permanent info that's stored, like memories, or knowing how to do something, like riding a bike. Other things like PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, order of operations. It's a long-term memory, because you came up with a strategy to remember it. So those would be your long-term memories. Also, there's something called the central executive, and it's kind of like the air trafficker of your sensory register, your short-term memory, and your long-term memories. It just kind of guides and flows. It directs the flow of information through the storage, through retrieval, through the attention, all of those things. And in the classroom, throughout math, throughout reading, we've come up with all these different schemes. Once again, order of operations, your vowels, just kind of things to help you remember, what you're doing. They develop long-term memory. They just develop ways for you to count, like, when you were counting on your fingers as a kid. There's all these different kinds of schemes. They're called central conceptual structures that just help us remember things. It's like a network of concepts, and it's kind of like a library, in your mind. You can just go in there, and as long as you have a way of trying to remember what the subject is, you can retrieve it. Just make a strategy. There have been a lot of fundamental discoveries about the development of information through the past. There's a Pagetian theory, there's a Vygotskian theory, and they all dive in to the scientific reasoning and the noting of indications of research findings for teaching. Pagetian stage, he talks about all these different stages. You'll learn how to do these strategies. Grouping helps. That's another strategy. And there's just a lot of theories out there, and yeah, it's kind of how your brain works. Remember, the central, it was the central executive. It's kind of like the air trafficker. It helps your sensory register, your short term, and your long term. So that's really all you got to remember on how your brain kind of stores energy. Bye.